Good evening, everyone. Now, we've assembled this evening primarily to have a brief lecture from UDAY BHASKAR sir, primarily on the prospects of India-China relationship, as well as the challenges that the relationship faces in the current 21st century. Now, the whole idea of this series of talks was given by ma'am herself, as her primary objective was to probably bring people whom we quote often in the class to the class to get more nuance in terms of the public discourse, as well as in terms of not just foreign policy but issues which go beyond foreign policy, to see how complexities affect the relationship and is not simply a matter of optics, and how does depth of any issue goes beyond the mere optics of what is probably shown or discussed in popular discourse, as ma'am's focus on discourse, right? So now Uday BHASKAR sir has been again one of those individuals who has been involved in foreign policy formulation, has for that matter served in the Navy up to the position of Commodore for a good 37 years. He has headed the IDSA, the premier think tank funded by the government from 1997 till 2004 in a deputy director position, and after that also as a director for a year. Apart from that, he's been part as a secretary of the government's task force, primarily on strategic issues in the period of probably around 2005 or 6. And it is at this time that, as we were just discussing, sir told us that he's worked with K. Subramaniam for almost a decade. And we know K. Subramaniam, the doyen of India's nuclear doctrine policy. And as Mr. Subramaniam was heading the task force on strategic issues, sir was the member secretary of the task force itself. So in that context, it's important often to have a view of people who've been in the establishment and who have seen how policy issues get formulated beyond the realm of academics as well. And also what is kind of rare, which many of us don't realize, is that it is relatively rare for people who have served in different positions in the security establishment to also have a very strong academic background. To that extent, sir has edited and has been the editor of the Strategic Analysis, a very premier research journal, which often is something that ma'am prefers for her own reading. So strategic analysis is something which anybody who's been involved in IR related studies knows is a go-to journal. In the sense, currently sir is heading an independent think tank, the Society for Policy Studies, and at the same point of time is an advisory member in the Indian Habitat Center, involved in organizing a number of talks on important policy matters. So he's also, a lot of us also keep asking, right, sir, what is the scope of think tanks, right? So he's the perfect guy to ask questions about what are the scope for think tanks and what is the scope for academics who may probably be looking beyond civil services for a career in such organizations as well. So with that brief introduction, I'll probably introduce sir. Sir is going to take questions from you after he finishes his brief, and then he can take questions from you as well. Thank you.
Find my specs 1 second. Judgment Yeah. Shubhra ji and members of the faculty here, can you hear me at the back? Yeah, okay. One request, I don't know if it's normally done here or not, but I'm presuming that all mobile phones are on silent. And also, if anybody needs to leave, I would only make a request that if you have to leave before 7:30, or at least 6:30, I want to speak for 1 hour. Can I request you to sit on one side so that you don't get up in the middle and distract both me and the other? So that's the only request I have. Again, good evening, and Shubhra ji, thank you very much for giving me this opportunity to be here. I've only heard about this particular institute and the great work you're doing as far as helping students with the civil service exam. It's only over the last week, literally 10 days, that I've met Mr. Jayesh and Mr. Burman. Is he here, Akshay? Yeah. So anyway, So that's how I'm here. And first of all, let me wish all of you, the very best in your endeavor to crack the civil service exam. And I'm sure that this institute has got very good track record in terms of the numbers. And I also hope that whatever remarks I'm making this evening would be of, some use. If nothing, I hope it will give you a greater awareness about the subject that, we are going to be talking about this evening. I was very glad when I heard Mr. Jayesh talking about the fact that Shubhra ji does pay a lot of emphasis and focus on IR theory. And I heard the word discourse. And I was very, very happy to hear that, because I personally am a student of discourse, and discourse in IR and discourse in politics, which I think is a very, very often not adequately recognized determinant, if I could use that word. And I spent some years in my younger days trying to read Foucault and understand the essentials. This is actually a digression from India and China, but I'll come back to that in a moment. But those of you who have an interest in this critical theory and these related subjects, there is what I call as a trapeze from Foucault to Baudrillard. And maybe at some other point we can talk about this and its relevance when we talk about IR and what is happening in global politics these days, but that will be for another day. I propose to do the following. Mr. Jayesh suggested that maybe I could talk about the Sino-Indian relationship, particularly after the most recent visit of the Chinese president, Mr. Xi Jinping, and look at the relationship in a slightly larger context, and then maybe make some kind of projection or assessment about the way ahead. So given the kind of time we have, I will try and address this in 4 different sections. One is to locate the Sino-Indian relationship in terms of the 2 interlocutors. What are the correspondences, what are the kind of characteristics that we could associate with these 2 entities. The second part will focus on why is there this animus, this kind of discord between India and China, and what is the genesis for that, and how can it be best managed? That would be the second kind of set of issues that we could discuss. The third is I do want to spend some time on China in global politics and China in regional politics, because they are all interrelated. And finally, I would like to identify, the equivalent of what is the way ahead for India to manage what I would describe as perhaps the most challenging and the most abiding relationship that India has over the next 20 to 30 years. And then we could move into QA. Would that be all right? So at the very outset, since we are talking about the contemporary period, I think it's more coincidence and no design that I'm speaking to you on October 21st, 2019. Now, those of you who have followed the Sino-Indian relationship would perhaps recognize that October 20th has a very, very special significance as far as the bilateral relationship is concerned, because it was on this day, October 20th, which was really yesterday, in 1962, that we had the Sino-Indian War, the attack by the Chinese PLA. And the fact that India, then Prime Minister Nehru, was at the helm of affairs here, was completely taken by surprise, and we actually had the equivalent of what I would describe as a humiliation. It was a national humiliation. And in many ways, I was a very young boy at that time. I was preparing for the NDA exams. I would say that these are scars that have still not been erased from the collective consciousness of India. Definitely people of my, I would say generation, to the extent that we can recall that. And those who were senior to me, I had a few people who were older, who were actually in that particular war. And therefore, there's a very, very live kind of recall of that. And in many ways, it has influenced the trajectory of the bilateral relationship for the last 57 years. So that is the temporal part. And we can relate that to the Chennai Connect, which is the new terminology that has been used of President Xi Jinping in Mamalapuram, Mahabalipuram, as we knew it at one time. And if you look at the Mahabalipuram meeting, I'm using that word because it comes easier than Mamalapuram. No disrespect, it's just that, I'm used to Mahabalipuram. That the actual takeaway is very limited. And if you would have, I'm sure most of you may have seen or read, there was a very good article in today's Hindu by Mr. Shyam Sara. I'm very glad to hear that all of you are aware of it. Then I don't have to repeat that. Basically, Shyam uses the same word that many of us had in the past described this immediately after Chennai, because Indian television constantly wants some breaking news. Kya hua hai, kya nahi hua hai. And I remember at that time we said that we should be glad that there was no breakdown. Meaning that if you remember what was happening in the days preceding the meeting in Mahabalipuram, the Chinese had protested the fact that India was carrying out an exercise in Arunachal Pradesh. India had protested that China had met with Imran Khan, Prime Minister Imran Khan, and had made a statement. There was a lot of tension, a lot of discord. And there was at one time, people even wondering whether the Chinese president will come or not come, because the announcement was not made. This is the nature of the relationship. So my own point is that yes, it was at best a holding operation. And I think both leaders reiterated what they had said in Wuhan also, which is that they would give strategic guidance. That is what the term that was used to their respective militaries and other officials to ensure that the relationship does not in any way get derailed. So I think that is the template of the nature of the bilateral relationship between India and China, which is that if you look back from 47, 49, when the two countries became independent, to where we are now, it's almost 70 years. As a matter of fact, it is 70 years. We'll talk about the October 1st PRA parade when we come to the tangibles about China. But I think as students, as those of you, beyond the exam itself, if you were to look at China and India and really ask yourself some ontological questions, the word ontological, going back to first principles, about India and China, what is it that strikes you? I would say the first aspect or the first element really is that these are both civilizational states. That's a term you must have heard or come across. That today, if you look at the 21st century, China and India are perhaps the only two exemplars of large demographies, large geographies that have retained a sense of continuity with their ancient past. There have been a number of ancient civilizations, if you leave India and China aside, which is really the Indic and the Cynic, as it is called in sociological terms. You had, for instance, the Egyptians, you had the Persians, you had the Greeks, you had various other civilizations, including the poor Iraqis, who were the inheritors of the Mesopotamian civilization. But they have all, by and large, either collapsed or they have, in a way, been, shrunk and reduced, or there have been very severe breaks in their own continuity. The Egyptians are a good example. They may have built the pyramids, but that's the only thing that remains now of the Egyptian civilization. The Persians are a more complex example. Today's Iran, after the 1979 revolution, has tried to, in many ways, I think, recreate or recall some of that. But that's a very small example. They don't have the demography. India and China, as I often say, are the two large examples of civilizational states that have maintained their continuity. China is a little more complex because of its own rejection of certain aspects, but that's another story for another date. The broad point is that while they may have this correspondence as two civilizational states, entities, and they were empires at one time, China had its own empire for 2000 years plus, India had its own history of empires going back to the Mauryan period to various disjunctions, and we close with the equivalent of the Mughal, in terms of India's own history, before you have the advent of British rule. But both of them in different ways were also subjected to what you might call as the excesses of colonialism. China had its own experience, we have our own experience, and that is where you find that there is a certain shared history in terms of even the modern experience, which is one of subjugation, a humiliation, and this is where the narrative becomes important. The discourse becomes important, that you recreate both the anxiety and the trauma that you were subjected to as a collective, as a people, and the aspiration. So there is a tendency also to burnish the past, and you have an imagined past, which is glorified, etc. China has its own way of recreating the past. China's attempt at recreating the past has been very innovative. They have actually recreated their maritime history. They have introduced this admiral, Zheng, and if you look at it, they have actually invested, and I don't want to say they have fabricated, but they have definitely burnished and made their history more glorious and grand. than it perhaps was. We in India are currently in our own, shall we say, attempt to try and also recall our past and give it a certain orientation and a certain sheen. But we are not alone. Many countries, when they are in a certain mode of consolidation and they are on the ascendant, Great Britain went through its own example of recreating or recalling a past. So did America, so did Russia. So it's not unprecedented, that's my point. But for India and China, the departure is in that period from 1950 onwards, meaning China becomes independent in 1949, free country, we become in 47, and we are a republic in 1950. So we give ourselves a constitution, and you can say that the idea of India, the identity of India, is a post-1950 product. That is where you find the divergence between India and China. And very briefly, let me make the following points, that while there is a correspondence in terms of geography, a correspondence in terms of area, there are a number of what I would describe as either divergences or dissonances that characterize India and China. The first, if you start from the geography and the demography, to the extent that India as we know it today, post-1950 India, is a product of partition. And what was the erstwhile British India, today we talk about an India which has now become three separate entities: India-Pakistan in 47, India-Pakistan-Bangladesh, which is post-1971, and of course the smaller states of Sri Lanka, Myanmar, etc., etc. China's unique kind of feature, if there is one single feature, it is homogeneity. Look at the geography of China. If you can imagine, and I deliberately haven't put maps because it tends to distract, but if you can imagine the geography of China, you will find that 90% or 91% of the last statistic of China is Han. Han, as you know, is an ethnicity. And the Han people, by and large, inhabit the center of China. Geography is very important, by the way. We have a geography professor. Much of history and various other aspects flow from geography and the strategic underpinning of geography. Just as we talk about India and say Himalayas and oceans and so on. China's geography has made China's history. Let me put it that way in a very simplistic manner. So 90% of China is in the central regions. Its population is, China's largest provinces have the least population. Tibet, if you look at the map. The erstwhile Xinjiang, which is now called Xinjiang, they have very sparse population, very limited, but they have the greatest area in terms of provinces. Most of China, like any large geography, is around the coastal areas and the deltas of the fertile, the rivers, etc. The interesting demographic pattern is that the 9%, 10% of non-Han Chinese occupy the periphery of China. So starting from Mongolia, if you come left and loop, you come towards Xinjiang, and then you come through Tibet, and you come to Kunming, and you go through Taiwan, and you come back and you complete the loop. So from Mongolia, turning anti-clockwise, you'll see that the non-Han part of China is scattered in this manner, and in many ways that is also the source of China's deepest insecurity. Meaning that if you look at Chinese history, there's a long period when the Mongols, were actually in the ascendant and ruled China. And today, if you look at the modern Chinese history, the emperor in China has always feared the revolution. So today, when President Xi Jinping is dealing with the protests in Hong Kong, I would say that his deepest anxiety when he gets up every day in the morning is not about Donald Trump and the trade war and not about Narendra Modi and the border in Wuhan and whatever, but about Hong Kong, and to ensure that there is no repetition of Tiananmen. Most of you remember Tiananmen 1989, what had happened, because that is the kind of protest and unrest that China fears the most, the domestic unrest, because there is always this historical recall and, as I said, the narrative that is embedded about what could happen to the emperor. So this is a very important characteristic about China, its demography, as also its geography, and the political choice it makes, which is China opts for communism. Mao Zedong, the Great March, and that the power of the state comes from the gun. So today in modern China, the PLA is not the military of the Chinese nation. No, it is the arm of the Chinese Communist Party. And that is how China is held together, which is why President Xi Jinping, his most powerful position or hat that he wears is not that of President of China, but the chairman of the CMC, the Chinese Military Commission. As also he is the General Secretary of the party. So that is what gives him, shall we say, primacy. So if you look at the contrast between India and China, as I said, to the extent that China is 90% Han and has the homogeneity, India's diversity is bewildering. If you look at demography, as is often said, that in India, the scale of the diversity is such that there's an old adage that quantity becomes quality. You're with me? In India, that is very true, because you can take any determinant of human identity. You could talk about ethnicity. In India, we also have this very special category of caste. We have religion, we have language, and within the ethnicities themselves, there is further division depending on whichever part of India that you are familiar with, whether it is the largest state UP or Bihar or the cowbelt states, or you go further south into Andhra, Tamil Nadu, Kerala. Literally from, every 10 kilometers, you could find a different way of identifying, within the same strata of the sociological and other indicators that you have. This is what I mean by the diversity of India. And I think, to India's credit, if you look at the idea of India, which I'm sure is something that all of you are are aware of, is all enshrined in the Constitution. And that, to my mind, is the greatest kind of attribute of India, which China is also unable to understand, that the Constitution empowered the people of India in a very normative sense. You know the word normative, right? That which is ideal, that which is positive, etc. And one of the greatest things that India did was to ensure that every citizen got a vote. Now, it's a different matter. India has corruption. India's governance is not up to speed. We are familiar with all of that. But normatively, the Constitution of India ensured that citizenship was indivisible. So irrespective of your religion, your caste, your ethnicity, and your gender, which India in many ways was far more advanced and enlightened than other democratic countries, because if you look even at the West, any of the countries that we now accept as major democracies, whether it's Britain, France, the United States, women, for instance, get the power of the vote much later in their own evolution, and that is more a reflection of the kind of patriarchy that you have in societies globally, not just in India. So these are all the features of India that make it very, very different from China. And the option that was made politically has also led, I would say, to the way in which the two countries have positioned themselves. Now, to link it with, both the Chennai Connect and October 20th, 1962, in that period from 1950 to roughly 1960, again, to reduce a complex history, I would say that both Prime Minister Nehru at that time in India and Chairman Mao in China saw themselves as the inheritors of the mantle of Asian leadership. But they were relatively, shall we say, not only inexperienced as leaders of free countries, they knew how to fight the colonial master or oppressor in different ways. China believed in the gun, India believed in the Gandhian non-violent way. They were relatively inexperienced in managing their own populations, their own countries. There were many challenges. And they also perhaps were not as aware of how do two large countries interact with each other, because till then there was no contact between India and China. The Himalayas were relatively impregnable, and the only contact, if any, across the land borders was that of Buddhism, which Mao in his own way had also rejected. So even that particular link was not given the kind of, shall we say, validity or sanctity it deserved. So we were really strangers to each other, but both Nehru and Chairman Mao wanted to be seen as the leaders of Asia, and that is where you see the beginning of the contestation as I interpret the history of that time. Yes, there was a brief period when there was a little kind of aspirational objective saying Hindi Chini bye bye, and that we would have Asian solidarity, and then Prime Minister Nehru brought in the non-aligned movement, and we had Egypt and we had Tito, all kinds of things. But specific to the relationship, I think Chairman Mao at that time was uneasy with the kind of profile that had been accorded to Prime Minister Nehru, who was educated in UK, who spoke English very fluently, also saw himself as a global statesman. And if you remember, at that time, India had played a very major role in the Korean War, which, if you remember the history of that period, China was one of the active participants in that war. Mao lost his own son, etc., etc. Now, India was the peacemaker in many ways under UN, not UN aegis, it was actually the Korean, shall we say, commission at that time. So my reading really is that China's own GDP per capita indicators were below India. In that period, if you look at the history, I mean, I have the detail, I don't want to give you too many figures about how many dollars and so on, but China's per capita was lesser than that of India, and India was seen as a country that was now into plans and making steel mills and whatever, and it seemed that India was moving ahead as the Asian power. This is where I think from the Indian side, perhaps Prime Minister Nehru was not able to appreciate geography. And therefore, we have what I would call as a slightly imprudent policy decision, that to the extent that India and China were both trying to consolidate their identities as states. Now, I'm sure that all of you who are familiar with political science would be aware that state as an entity is normally born in violence or when there is some tectonic global or regional event. For instance, something that you may remember is the implosion of the former Soviet Union. The Soviet Union imploded without a bullet being fired. But what happened? When the Soviet Union imploded, it's like an earthquake. The Soviet Union goes into the cracks and you have new states emerging, of which Russia is one. Along with that, you have the stans in Central Asia, you have the states in the European sort of, what do you call them, the Baltic states and so on. So this is what I mean by recent history. So if you look at 5,000 years of global history, states are born, states collapse, they implode, then you have the emergence of new states. So when a state is born, its primary responsibility or anxiety, it's like, if you have a newborn child, is survival. Who looks after the survival? The mother. So like that, this particular entity of the state has a deep anxiety about territoriality. So you want to consolidate territoriality. I don't want to make this a lecture into political science theory, but the attribute of state is that you need to have a geography. That means you need to have area that is accepted as being under your control, right? And that geography has to have a border. That border must be accepted by your neighbors and by the global community. In today's context, we talk about the United Nations, etc., etc. So for China and India, the challenge is that they were differently, shall we say, deeply anxious about their territoriality. For China, the biggest, shall we say, anxiety, or it remains unresolved to date, is Taiwan. That the composite China had lost one large chunk, which politically was represented by the KMT of that period, which was the antithesis of Mao's China, communist China. For India, from birth, October 1947, we are still talking about Jammu and Kashmir, the composite state, and whether or not it will come back to India in its composite form. So this territoriality is, as I said, a deep anxiety for most states, more so for India and China. And therefore, the dissonance, the discord starts in that period 60 onwards because of what I would call as the Asian tussle between Mao and Pandit Nehru about who would be seen to be donning the mantle of Asian leadership. You see suspicion, you see mistrust, and the kind of animus between the two of them. And it actually peaks and then in a way explodes when Prime Minister Nehru believes that India has a claim on certain parts that China claims to be its own. We've already gone through Tibet and suzerainty, and all of that has already been politically resolved. And Prime Minister Nehru, I think, in his own way, instructs his military to say that throw the Chinese out. Now that is also insulting, to the Chinese, who see themselves as very, civilizationally older than India, larger than India. So long and short is that we have the war of October 1962. It also happens when the global focus is on the Cuban Missile Crisis. Now that is my linkage, saying that whatever is happening here does have a resonance in terms of global geopolitics and global IR. So I will touch upon that in the third part about China and its own locus when we talk about global strategy and global IR. But this is the snapshot saying that India and China may ostensibly have some correspondences, but there is a very deep anxiety in China about India. As I said, it comes from the fact that China is a communist state and is unable to accept that India is a democracy. India was a very robust democracy. India was a noisy democracy. And there was a time when China was actively trying to undermine Indian democracy by supporting communist parties and groups that were actually being encouraged to unravel the Indian state. So we have gone through all of that. It's not as if we haven't. And the 62 war was what I would call as also it has a domestic Chinese political angle. It has to do with Mao and his own power tussle within the Politburo and various other domestic political developments. But for us, the bilateral takes what I would call as a very sharp dip, and India and China effectively from 62 onwards do not even have the equivalent of high-level political contact till Rajiv Gandhi goes in 88, but that's much later. So this is where I'll stop the first part to say that while India and China have certain correspondences, what is really, I think, in the subtext is the fact that both of them are very wary of each other, but they are also in many ways trapped by geography, meaning India cannot ignore or conduct its own relations in a manner that would be oblivious to the China factor. And whatever China may say, China cannot be oblivious to the fact that India is still existing as a democracy on its neighborhood, and in a way questioning the Chinese certitude that only communism, and now Xi Jinping has said this many times, that the Chinese model is the answer to the world's many, shall we say, inadequacies, including the fact that democracy may not be the best form of governance. This is where we are now. And in this period, let me stop here, just make one point, that to the extent that India and China, as I said, were comparable, India's per capita in the 50s was higher than that of China, but China had a higher demography at that time. You find that by the time you come to 1978, their economic indicators are comparable. India is slightly better off, just slightly better off. But it is after that, that once Chairman Mao has exited and he is no longer there, he dies, you find the beginning of the reforms in China, which differently accelerated, and under the leadership of Deng Xiaoping, there is a small blip when you have Tiananmen. But China's own economic progress becomes more visible, becomes more rapid, and as you canter through the post-Tiananmen phase, I would say, you find the differential. China becomes more prosperous, and if I remember right, China's GDP, is $1 trillion in 1997-98. It crosses $1 trillion at that point. That's the year when India carries out the nuclear test with Prime Minister Vajpayee, but that correlation we'll do later. It takes China, if you look at the most recent figures, China's GDP now in actual terms has crossed $13 trillion. It's a remarkable statistic that in a 20-year period, China's GDP increases 12 times. I'm not saying 13 because it's roughly 12 times. And that was enabled because they have double-digit growths, GDP growths, steadily for about 7 to 8 years. There's a golden decade, in that transition from, I would say, Hu Jintao to early Deng Xiaoping. So pre-Hu Jintao and early Xi Jinping, before the economic slowdown. And I don't think in modern history we have had such a rapid growth anywhere, and that becomes even more relevant and even more, I would say, as a stark indicator when we look at India's own challenges, that at the moment there is an aspiration that India would become a $5 trillion economy, but I personally am not very optimistic, because you need to touch growth rates of 9 to 10% over an extended period to be able to double your GDP. And for India to do this under the present, I would say. So what is happening for us, again, for purposes of our discussion, the differential between India and China is now growing. I would say about roughly 7 years ago, 2007-8, we all believed that India is actually narrowing the gap because we were doing reasonably well. But today, after 7 to 8 years, I mean, I distinctly remember 2008 when there was a lot of confidence that India will not only reduce the gap but catch up with China, is now, I think, very, very low probability. Because all things being equal, unless there is some black swan event in China, all indicators are that by the time we come to 2027, 28, which is literally a decade, you can imagine where you were 10 years ago. I'm sure you will have some wish list about where you want to be 10 years from now. So it's in our, comprehension. We are going to have a situation where China overtakes the United States to become the world's largest GDP. And along with that, it also is going to create certain anomalous kind of situations and conditions, which is for the first time in global history, when you come to 27, 28, the world's number one GDP will not be the world's most militarily powerful country. It hasn't happened in recent global history for the last 100 years, because in the modern period, the most prosperous nation or a cluster of nations have been both economically and militarily ascendant at the same time. What that will do to global politics and geopolitics, we do not know, but I'll come to that later. So let me stop here. This is to really, I think, give you what I would call as the overview of the two countries, the two entities, India and China, and the fact that they both have aspirations. China wants to be the most developed country in the world by 2049, which is 100 years from the Chinese Revolution of 1949. And Xi Jinping, who is now emperor for life, hopes to be in power at least for the next decade plus, so that from 2019 where we are, perhaps he wants to be in a position where 20 years before 2049, he's able to at least prove to his own people that we have become the world's number one GDP. They're doing some remarkable things. I would like to place on record as an analyst that what China is doing needs to be, I think, acknowledged and commended. The very fact that they are now aiming for 99% removal of poverty. There are some various indicators and metrics. I think they have set themselves a target of 2021, which is roughly 2 years from now, that China would, at the moment they say that their poverty removal, eradication, has touched 90%. 90% on a base of 1.3 billion is an extraordinary, kind of achievement. Because we remember China in the 80s when it was seen as a relatively low income country with all kinds of, challenges, etc. But the reason why China, and this perhaps all of you are civil servants in the making in terms of your aspirations, the reason why China is able to make these strides is because they have their foundations, I would say, very well laid out, which is going back to Mao Zedong's time, literacy and health were given very high priority. Even at the height of the Cultural Revolution, while lots of people died, even when they had the Great Famine, they ensured that the younger generation, both in terms of its health and its education, was not as adversely impacted. Then, of course, under Deng Xiaoping, it takes a much greater stride. And I think there is a very deep policy lesson for us in India, but we'll talk about that later. So let me stop here on this point to talk about the way in which China and India have their own aspirations, and they have their anxieties. So the challenge for India is to manage both the aspiration and the anxiety, whether it's territoriality, Aksai Chin, Arunachal, Tawang, etc., which is one aspect. The second is, how will China, how does China envision Asia? Now, as a security analyst, I often say that China wants a unipolar Asia, where they see themselves as the only power in terms of primacy. Therefore, they do not want to cede any space to India or to Japan. When I say this to my Chinese friends, I go there once in a while for the odd seminar and whatever, they give us the rhetoric. China is a peaceful country and we don't want this, we look after our neighbors, but I keep telling them that that is not true. Your behavior, does not in any way sort of, there's a sort of mismatch between your word and deed. And that is really the second part of what I wanted to discuss, which is, I hope this part is okay, reasonably sort of got some broad sense about India and China. Now let's move to the second part, which is, why is it that there is this deep, as I said, mistrust and this kind of discord between India and China? Though in public, they talk about the Asian century, we are brothers, we are civilizational, we have gone through the colonial experience, which as I said is the rhetoric that is often packaged by both sides. I have the following kind of observations to make as to where does the discord begin and what kind of a shape has it taken in the last, say, few years, and where are we going from here. As I said, if you look at the early decade, 50 to 60, China, India, I think were trying to find their feet in terms of both Asian geopolitics as also consolidating their domestic priorities, and both leaders, Mao and Nehru, were reaching the end of their own, and they were also getting old, and they were not as young and dynamic as they were at one time, and they had to hand over to the next kind of leadership, but they were not quite sure how they would go about it. My own reading is that after October 1962, Mao established the fact that China is the stronger power and that India would have to accept a certain degree of subalternity in the bilateral relationship, which is something that India was not willing to accept. So we went into what I would call as deep introspection to see how India would deal with this kind of a China. And in the decade that follows, 62 to 72, some very significant things happen. And one is global, which is the United States is also reviewing what you might call its Southern Asia policy, which is linked to the containment policy in relation to the Soviet Union. So you find that in the United States, which till that point had not recognized mainland China, if you remember that first decade after the end of World War II, they recognized KMT and Taiwan was given the seat in the UN. It's only in the 60s that after China carries out its own nuclear test in October 1964, America accepts the reality and is trying to rearrange its own relationship in Asia with Beijing. India is a country that has been relatively difficult for the Americans because India under Pandit Nehru and subsequently both Lal Bahadur Shastri and Mrs. Indira Gandhi remains committed to non-alignment and refuses to be part of the US-led Western alliance at that time. Pakistan is identified as the frontline state, and ironically, in Asia, Pakistan and Iran are the two so-called non-NATO allies of the United States as part of the containment of communism. So these are all the various wheels within wheels that are moving. And for India, that period from 62 onwards, when India consolidates and also decides that it needs to have far greater or pay more attention to its military capability, you see an attempt to consolidate. We go through the 65 war, Indira Gandhi becomes Prime Minister, and there is a very significant kind of regional political flux that is going on, which is Pakistan for its own reasons. As I said, without going into domestic politics of Pakistan, you see the beginning of the East Pakistan problem for Pakistan, which again comes back to some issues that we discussed earlier, which is how is a nation to identify itself on the basis of ethnicity, on the basis of religion, on the basis of language, or on the basis of a shared political vision. Pakistan opts for religion, as we are aware, in August of 1947, and it has these two wings, West Pakistan, East Pakistan, which is today's Bangladesh. It is an unnatural kind of formation of a nation state, where the two wings are separated geographically by a huge, India is in between. And furthermore, to the extent that Jinnah has a vision about Islam and religion being the unifying factor for the identity of Pakistan, the reality plays out differently, which is the ethnic domination by what is called as the Punjabi Musalman. If you're familiar with the history of Punjab and West Pakistan, and the way in which that particular ethnicity commandeers various levers of state, and within that, the Pakistani army has already taken over power. You have General Ayub Khan and what follows Ayub Khan, and the way in which the East Pakistan is seen as the lesser cousin. That is a Bengali speaking, different ethnicity, and the long and short is that Pakistan is unable to accept the democratic principle of one man, one vote, and that Mujibur Rahman, who is the father of Sheikh Hasina, the current Prime Minister, has actually emerged as the politically elected leader. West Pakistan cannot accept that, so there are all kinds of things happen, which peak in the genocide of Bangladesh, where if you visit Bangladesh, if some of you have gone there, they have a national memorial, which actually records that 3 million people were killed over a period of 18 months, which is a staggering number. Even if you do a kind of quick calculation and say how many people have to be killed on a daily basis to reach 3 million, it's tragic, it's horrendous. Even if you do not accept the 3 million figure and say it was 1 million, even then it's tragic. But this is part of what I often say, that South Asia's history is soaked in blood. But the challenge for India is that what do we do with this? Again, to cut the long story short, Indira Gandhi as Prime Minister arrives at a strategic determination. We have a very, I would say, capable team, the cabinet, the army, Manik Shaw, the Air Force, Navy, etc. And we have what you might call as a very clearly thought out military plan, whereby the refugees are accommodated in India at a time today when we are worried about 100,000 Rohingyas. 100,000 is 1 lakh. India in 1971 provided shelter to 10 million refugees, give and take. No cell phones, no computers, no television, and yet this state, which had problems feeding its own people, was able to provide that kind of shelter politically for these people. And we had this military operation wherein there was an emphatic military victory that leads to the birth of Bangladesh. Now, if you look at the period from 1945, when World War II ends with Hiroshima and Nagasaki, to 1991 December, when the Soviet Union implodes, you have 46 years of the Cold War. In that period, this is often not acknowledged in India because we have our own recall of history, which is sometimes blurred. No country, and I repeat, no country at that time had such an emphatic military victory as India did, wherein you actually dismembered another state. It's true that they had engaged in genocide and they were killing their own people, but India enabled it militarily. It captured 93,000 prisoners of war. And that's a different matter. Unfortunately, we were not able to consolidate the political objective of that war, meaning that India could have done various things. Now, in hindsight, I would say so. But the reality is that we returned all the prisoners. We did not take an inch of Pakistani territory. We did not take an inch of Bangladeshi territory, even to consolidate your access to the northeast. This was Indira Gandhi's political conviction at that time, that we will do all this through the political process and not as victors. And I'm a military man. I did almost 40 years in the Navy, so you study a lot of military history. We did not take a single rupee as what is called as reparations. I mean, if you study World War I and World War II, a very heavy fiscal penalty was imposed on those countries that were defeated for, the kind of costs that were incurred. India didn't do any of these things. And this is part of India's, I would say, USP, distinctive profile, but we'll discuss that at some other point. My reason for detailing all this is to say that for China, in 1971, December, the birth of Bangladesh, to my mind, unsettled them completely. Here was a country where, as they say, they kicked them very hard in the shins and humiliated India in October 1962. In less than 9 years, this country has bounced back. It has dismembered Pakistan, it has created a new state, and it is seen Indira Gandhi was at the peak of her international profile as this woman leader, woman prime minister, who had taken her country to. Falklands happens much later. Margaret Thatcher comes much later. It's almost a decade later, in 82, that you have Falklands. So Indira Gandhi was what I would call at the peak of her own personal thing. And my reading again is that for Chairman Mao in particular, this was something that was not very, shall we say, appealing, something that they were not able to live with. And I argue as an analyst, very often I've written about this, that this is the beginning of where the seeds of discord and suspicion, mistrust are sown. And China decides that the only way that India could be contained is that they invest in Pakistan. Now, you can trace this, there are various ways of doing it. And concurrently, China also decides that it's going to rewire its international relations. And you see the rapprochement, the elements are already there. Kissinger has made the secret visit from United States to China, and Nixon's famous meeting, and the fact that the thaw in the US-China relationship, which affects the larger picture, which is the global Cold War. And that actually goes back to a split between Beijing and Moscow, and that's a different kind of trajectory and a different track that we have to follow, but it is relevant. So in that period 72 onwards, you find that China makes this, what I would call as strategic decision, that to contain India, to keep India unsettled, that we would invest in Pakistan, and the beginning of what I often describe as the Sino-Pak strategic cooperation. Now again, we'll shift to this third part very soon. How are we for time? Can I go up to what, 6:40? 45? No problem? Huh? I was planning to finish by 6:30, but I'm not likely to finish. Which is that at that time, when India is coming out of what I would call as the birth of Bangladesh, and we are also having our own domestic issues, emergency, etc., etc. The global strategic, currents impact this part of the world, which is 1979. Please make a note of this. I often say it is the most tectonic year for Southern Asia. 3 events happened in 1979. To date, 40 years later, you can see the effect of those events. The first, I'm sure most of you are very familiar, is the overthrow of the Shah of Iran. The beginning of the Ayatollahs coming into Iran, and in regional politics, it is the beginning of the ascendancy of Shia political power in the politics of Islam. So we'll talk about that later. Iran, Ayatollah, overthrow of the Shah. The second tectonic event is, again you may remember this, the Soviet invasion / occupation of Afghanistan. It happens in December of that year. And it brings the Cold War literally onto the Indian doorstep, meaning South Asian doorstep. And the third, which is not adequately recognized very often, is the attempt by a group of militants / terrorists to capture the Holy Mosque in Makkah. So you see the beginning of militancy / terrorism in relation to Islam. And I often say that this is the first non-state kind of appearance. It's different that they have got some linkages and support, which is more with the politics of Saudi Arabia and Islam. But these 3 events differently create the kind of undercurrents that in many ways lead to a whole lot of other absolutely global events, including 9/11. So I'm just flagging them for you for purposes of saying that for India, that particular period, and for the Southern Asian region, not just South Asia, Southern Asia from Saudi Arabia to Indonesia, that also includes China, all these countries were being affected by these undercurrents, and the bilateral relationship with the bilateral relationship with China was also being impacted or influenced. So what are the tangibles? What happens in that period? China having invested in Pakistan, as I said, by the time you come to the late 70s, early 80s, and you have President Zia-ul-Haq in Pakistan, the military leader, you see the beginning of the introduction of religion into the ideology of Pakistan in a very assertive and militant way. It's also the equivalent of the blowback from Afghanistan, because when the Soviets are in Afghanistan from the period 1979 to roughly 1989 when they start withdrawing, the United States is supporting Pakistan to create the Mujahideen. So there is a very famous image of a forefather of Bin Laden, you might say, somebody who looks like that, with a Kalashnikov in one hand and the Quran in the other. And you see the emergence and the legitimization of the holy warrior. And this is where you see the leavening, as I often say, of politics and religion in an exceedingly corrosive way, because you have unleashed certain forces which you cannot control. If I can make this digression, you heard of Max Weber? You know the Weberian formulation about the legitimacy of force. The state is, the soul has monopoly on macro force. It also is a legitimate actor in terms of the application of macro force, etc. It is in this period I often say that Weber is stood on his head, because the non-state entity has now become a potent actor. And if a Mujahid can carry a Stinger missile on his shoulder and bring down a helicopter, you are seeing something which the traditional state apparatus had not envisioned. Till then, the non-state was engaged in criminality, at best espionage, but all our histories of World War I and World War II was that militaries engaged militaries, air forces engaged air forces. You didn't suddenly have this non-state guy coming up and being as capable as he was. All those effects, I would say, are being felt now, and China is also, shall we say, in many ways picking up bits and pieces of this as to what do you do with this, because the missile has entered South Asia. Okay? Till then, there were no missiles that were being used in a tangible way. So China has already acquired the technological ability to manufacture missiles. It had been assisted by the former Soviet Union, and it sends the first long-range missiles to Saudi Arabia. They're called the CSS-2. And that is the beginning of what you might call as a change in the WMD. WMD is weapons of mass destruction. And by the time you come into the late 70s, early 80s, the other big change that has taken place is that since China has gone nuclear in October 1964, India's own strategic profile has been depressed. You know, how do I give you an example? What happens when a country carries out a nuclear test in your proximity? I think the best example you can give is, if you can imagine a tennis ball, right? It's a fairly resilient thing, a tennis ball. If you depress it with your thumb, you know, the ball is depressed, right? It's still there as it is. But this is what I would say the nuclear test does in a proximate situation, where the moment China carried out its nuclear test in October 64, existentially, India's sovereignty and strategic space was depressed. Not because China would attack India with its nuclear weapon, but this is existential. So India had to live with this particular anxiety. What do we do with a nuclear China, which has already taught us a military lesson in October 1962? India decides that it must acquire something similar, but Indira Gandhi has her own constraints as the Prime Minister. So we do the next best thing, which is we carry out the peaceful nuclear explosion of May 1974, which means that we demonstrate what is called as technological capability. India is great at this. You know, we have technology demonstrators, but we do not weaponize. And if I could use a sort of lighter vein remark, there's an old Polish saying that you cannot cross a chasm in two leaps, right? You understand? You can get the image. You can't cross a chasm in two leaps. India is the only country that shows that yes, we can do it. And in 1974, we do half a jump and we remain suspended. Now, I don't know how many of you are familiar with Hindu mythology, but there is an episode of Trishanku, if you know that particular thing, where he is suspended between the heavens, the cosmos, and terra firma, etc., etc. But again, this I think is an Indian cultural trait. Hopefully, we can have a chat about this when we discuss strategic culture. But India's anxieties are palpable. China has gone nuclear. What China does is that not only has it improved its own relationship with the United States, it has also encouraged India to enter into what is called as friendship treaty with the Soviets. And in that period, the tangibles are that China begins to provide Pakistan missile capability and nuclear weapon capability. So that by the time you come into the mid-80s and Prime Minister Rajiv Gandhi is here, I think now we can talk about these things. On the Rajiv Gandhi watch, when he's Prime Minister, there is an appreciation in India that there is a nuclear gap between India and China. Between India and Pakistan, I beg your pardon. India and China is already there. But by the time you come into the mid-late 1980s, there is a WMD gap in Pakistan's favor, because China has enabled Pakistan to get both the missile and the nuclear weapon. There's a secret nuclear test, Lopnor, etc., etc. And the fallout of that is that Pakistan uses its own WMD capability to invest in terror. Meaning, for their own reasons, they have picked up some lessons from the Afghan war, the Mujahideen ideology, and the Cold War is over. The Soviet Union has disappeared. No more troops in Afghanistan. All these Mujahideen are relatively unemployed, and what do you do with them? So Pakistan comes up with this strategy that they would invest in terror and they use the nuclear weapon as a shield. So in the literature I have also written, others have written, I have called this nuclear weapon enabled terror, NWET. The government of India had once used a phrase saying that this is terrorism behind a nuclear shield. They use the word TBNS, but basically it's the same thing. And India's security is slowly getting degraded. Starting with January 1990, if you remember, where I said earlier, ideology, religion and politics have now been leavened. You know the word leavened. And the direct impact or result for India is when you have the Kashmiri Pandits being expelled. There's a pogrom. People are killed. And I say this quite unequivocally that the Indian state abdicated, which was unfortunate because I think if we had a different kind of response at that time, perhaps, just perhaps, you can't second guess history, but I think the reality is that the state abdicated for various reasons and therefore the scourge of terrorism which was being driven or impelled by a certain distortion of religious kind of tenets at that time, the so-called Islamic fervor, which also played out in the regional politics, India continues to pay a price. You know, if Mumbai happened in 2008 in November, I would say that there are non-linear linkages with that. So getting back to our main theme of discussion today, China has enabled Pakistan to behave in this manner. And China also has now, therefore I often say, I've said this in China, they get very upset with me, that they have not been a responsible state. Because they have used nuclear weapons, but in a manner that goes completely against, you all have gone through your lectures on nuclear deterrence, right? We speak about the core mission. The core mission of the nuclear weapon is only to deter the use of another nuclear weapon. That's the normative understanding. What China and Pakistan have demonstrated, I often say, is this innovative way, but not to be, it's not a particularly, shall we say, commendable way in terms of the responsibility that has been exuded by either Beijing or in this case Rawalpindi, wherein they have linked up nuclear weapons with terrorism. And Southern Asia today, I think, is paying the price for that particular thing, that particular kind of path that was taken. And therefore, when we look at the bilateral relationship and where the discord begins, how it manifests itself and where it is going, you can see that China uncritically, even as recently as 2 months ago in the United Nations, was supporting Pakistan in terms of terror, saying that, you know, whether it is the Financial Action Task Force or it is having to censure Pakistan for supporting terror to such groups, listing of individuals, they have provided uncritical attention, support. And the contradiction, they are quite happy to live with it, which is that they have 1 million citizens of Chinese nationality but Muslim faith in detention camps because they want to, in many ways, eradicate, re-educate them, etc. China has no problem living with that. So my brief point is that whether we talk about the nuclear issue, India NSG, India United Nations, India Pakistan, China has made it very clear that they are not going to give up on Pakistan. So therefore, when we talk about how India is going to deal with this relationship, how India is going to manage this relationship, I think we have to see this as a given. It's unlikely to change as I see it in the near future. And therefore, whatever India does, and we have to be a little, I think, circumspect about how much you want to project into the future and see whether or not you can make an informed assessment. So let me stop the second part over here. And I hope this has given you some idea about the roots and the kind of triggers for the discord and the animosity between India and China. And it has continuously played out in different ways. You have seen, even after Prime Minister Modi has come to office, from Modi 1.0 to where we are Modi 2.0, we have had a number of instances where Chinese and Indian troops have actually jostled with each other, and they have come to very tense situations, and then the diplomats and the politicians have stepped in. And that is why post Doklam, if you remember, we had the Wuhan spirit and the visit to just contain the issue. Now again, let me not make this sound very bleak. I think there is one positive kind of feature, which again Shyam Saran has mentioned in his article today, that if you look at the long kind of history of India-China relationship post-Cold War, because they go through Tiananmen, which is one more, as I said, insecurity for them, 1989. From 1992 onwards, which is the post-Cold War kind of history, to where we are now, roughly 26, 27 years, Prime Minister Narasimha Rao and President Jiang Zemin, if you remember, in 93, they signed a very important agreement, which is peace and tranquility. And from then to now, it is, I think, something that we can get a lot of satisfaction from. We have 4,000 plus kilometers of unresolved territorial dispute. No borders. It's notional. You have the west, the central sector, and the eastern sector. But to the credit of the militaries on both sides, whether you call this prudence or you call this extreme caution, not a shot has been fired till now in anger. I often say as an analyst that this is like an ozone layer. You know, sunlight, ozone layer, you know that whole, physics of it. When this particular ozone layer is punctured, meaning that if a bullet is fired in anger, whether it's in Doklam or elsewhere, I think it will test the perspicacity of the political leadership and the nationalism. We come back to your point about narratives and discourses. Because both India and China have now emoted the issue. If you read Chinese media, you will see Chinese social media, whatever. This whole question of China's territorial integrity, splitism. And if there are any enemies, we'll crush their bones. I don't know if you guys heard Xi Jinping most recently when he spoke in Nepal. So they have also emoted the issue. We have also emoted the issue. Now, most recently after August 5th, when we've had the JNK 370, now we are talking about getting POK back. And then in POK, there is also Aksai-Chin. So we have also emoted, if I may use that word, the issue. And that is why I often, as an analyst, I'm a bit concerned saying that in the event, there is some kind of exigency or an exchange of ordnance, I would say that it would test, as I said, the perspicacity and the maturity on both sides. We hope it doesn't happen in a hurry, but that's where we are now. So can I stop here and then move on to the third part? I'm still going to the third part. Fourth tak pahunchna hai. The third part really is that, what about China and the global, kind of calculus? How does China figure in the larger global matrix, and what does that do to India? Let me try and compress this to make one point. China's locus in terms of global geopolitics comes from two factors. One is de facto, the other is de jure. Meaning that as a permanent member of the United Nations Security Council, which, as I said, status was given to it when Taiwan was moved out and Beijing comes in, China is at the high table. And therefore, when we talk about any major global decision, though it was a relatively irrelevant player in the Cold War, because it had hitched its own fortune with the former Soviet Union as two communist states. And then in the second part, it was by and large playing a junior partner role to the United States. Because remember, China had its own insecurities at that time, the transition from Mao to Deng Xiaoping, Tiananmen happening, all of that. In the post-Cold War, I would say that China becomes a more confident player. And from the 90s onwards, China's own economic power has also made it a more credible player in the international kind of arena. And I think that particular decade is a very critical decade for China when they not only, as I said, 98, 99 from $1 trillion in that period following 98 to 2008, their entire attention is on using the global ecosystem to improve their own profile. Therefore, the investment in manufacturing, steel production, all kinds of other things that China does, the Chinese miracle as it were. So by the time you come into the transition from Hu Jintao to Jiang Zemin, I would say the Chinese Olympics are a symbol. If you remember the Chinese Olympics held under Hu Jintao's watch, of the arrival of China as a credible power, as a major power. And in the transition from Obama to Donald Trump, I think a window of opportunity strategically presents itself to China to become a major player, because in that period, China's own trade surplus with the United States has reached a completely, phenomenal level. And Japan itself has dropped its own ranking. And in this period, if you remember, China has overtaken Japan to be the world's number 2 GDP. So today, we are in a situation where, as I said, China brings economic heft to the global table. So when you talk about geoeconomics, you talk about trade as a globalization kind of manifestation, China is there, as a very credible player. And in the security and strategic domain, China has also asserted itself in the 9-dash line, the South China Sea. China has established itself as a very credible player in the Korean Peninsula because of its support to North Korea. China has become a very potent player in South Asia because of its support to Pakistan. And most recently, China has also made a fairly visible and large investment in Africa. So you can see that China's deep pockets, now under Xi Jinping, they have started on the Belt and Road Initiative, the BRI. So basically, you can see that earlier we used to talk about the peaceful rise of China. Now they have dropped the word peaceful. And they have made it very clear. There was one of the ASEAN summits, I remember, where the Chinese foreign minister said quite bluntly that you guys in ASEAN have to accept that you're small countries and we are China, and you accept whatever we tell you. You know, it's going back to the Middle Kingdom, and that China will be the equivalent of the boss, and the others have to genuflect, as they say, you know, pay your token, whatever, to accept Chinese supremacy in the region. Whether or not it will happen is a different matter, but that's, I'm saying, Chinese wish list is there. Now, in the global context, China would like to be seen as the peer of the United States. And I would say they are going about it in a very determined manner. And today, I think the real kind of tussle is going to be on 5G. Technology, 5G, yeah, Huawei. And whether or not China can provide the alternative to the United States, still which recently, or the Western model you might say, was seen as the only kind of, shall we say, shop in town, if you will, for the rest of the world to pick up technology that was seen to be cutting edge. And my own reading is that, you know, at this point in time, the United States is slightly handicapped because of President Donald Trump. And he in turn has introduced a very deep degree of divisiveness in the United States, and many of the fundamental, you know, kind of basic principles of the American system, American democracy, American politics, American trade investment are all being either jettisoned or they are being diluted, and I think it will take America some time. Now, one school of thought believes that Donald Trump will come back because he has already convinced his own, you know, supporters and base that, you know, the white American is under threat and therefore you must support or vote Donald Trump. How this plays out, we don't know. I would also say that President Xi Jinping has now got his own challenges because Hong Kong is actually going to be more complex than what, you know, it's not just about one small city state. But I think the possibility that there could be a blowback both for Taiwan, because he has to demonstrate that he will bring Hong Kong, literally, as to use a crude word, to heel. And once he finishes with Hong Kong, he is going to turn his attention to Taiwan. In this period, if something happens, if the balloon goes up on any issue, I'm just saying hypothetically, I know we're being recorded, I'm not saying that Tibet is going to blow up, but if something were to happen, this is what we mean by the black swan, it would pose a very serious challenge for President Xi Jinping. Even if something were to happen, say hypothetically in Xinjiang now, with the Muslim citizens of China, the Uyghur rebels, citizens as they call them, and their own indoctrination programs, and what is happening currently in West Asia. Because this is what I mean, that international relations is very complex as a mosaic. There are all kinds of linkages that sometimes we do not adequately note or acknowledge. And I personally think that what is happening in Turkey now is a long fuse that has been lit. And whether the IS comes back or not, we are not very sure. But it has unleashed, I think, a new force in terms of the, again, we are talking about a non-state that is getting support from other parts. But the very fact that between Turkey and Syria there is this contestation, I think is going to lead to problems which might play back into, as I said, the entire southern Asian region. So the brief point I'm saying about global geopolitics is that China is a very significant player. Today, China is also an uncertain player. China has its own domestic economic problems. China has its, as I said, political issues. China has territoriality. In as much as India, by the way, is also dealing with similar challenges. So you might make a broader point to say that if you look at these three countries, the United States, China, and India, which is the new strategic triangle, and I think this is where I can make my transition to the last part. which is that if you look at the next 10 to 15 years, as a student of IR, I often say that you should be very modest and cautious about not making projections beyond 20 years. And what I mean by that is, if you look at the 20th century, if you were an analyst, if you were a student, if you were an academic in 1910, 1911, nobody imagined that the Archduke would be assassinated in 1914 and that it would lead to the First World War. The Great War was tragic. Half of Europe's young men died in trenches. Well, again, I don't want to make this a lesson in military history, but millions died and they did not move more than 20 yards. There were trenches here and there were trenches at the end of the room. And millions died, in terms of the advance in Europe. This is World War I. Gas was used, all kinds of things happened. If the same analyst, the same student, the same professor, the same diplomat or the world leaders were looking at the world after the end of the war in 26, 27, nobody anticipated the Great Depression. Nobody anticipated Hitler, the rise of fascism, and the fact that the world would again be at war in 1939. Hiroshima and Nagasaki happens in 45. 47, 48, the Soviets and the Americans had fought the war on the same side. Few could have imagined that we would actually have a Cold War and that we could almost have a nuclear exchange in the Cuban Missile Crisis. We were lucky to have survived that. And if you studied international relations and history in the 80s, I was a student at that time, we were talking about thousands of nuclear weapons and this will happen, first strike, and 28 million people will die in the former Soviet Union. They will strike from their submarines and 18 million Americans will die. People were calculating this through using tools of mathematics. OR was a very preferred discipline to do gaming and mapping and targeting and all. This is a very serious profession. So in the mid-80s, when you had Reagan and Gorbachev, nobody imagined that the Cold War would actually end in December 1991 without a shot being fired. Look at the anomaly. The United States has spent $6.1 trillion on WMD at $1984. It would be a phenomenal amount now. And not a shot was fired. So you created inventory, you created assets, and as I said, I'm talking about certitude and IR. When the Cold War ended, George Bush stood up and said that this is the end of all history. Francis Fukuyama. The new world order has come and the United States stands taller. It sees further. And this is liberal democracy in the free markets, all kinds of very rosy assessments, 92, 93. Because the United States had just come out of the war for Kuwait, if you remember, where it emerged as this victorious superpower. The Soviet Union had gone. Literally a few years later, they were caught completely unawares by the enormity of 9/11. September 2001, you had the non-state actor, Bin Laden, Al-Qaeda. So my short point is that as students of IR, as academics, as policymakers, whatever, that we should be a little cautious about the assessment. So what I'm proposing is the following, that if you look at the next 10 to 15 years, which I think is a reasonable thing, one can only talk about possibilities, exigencies, probability factors, etc. I make the following case, which is where I'll close the remarks now, that there is the emergence of a strategic triangle. And this strategic triangle would comprise of the United States still as a very credible leading economic power, military power, a political power, a technological power, an educational power, all the attributes that we associate with both hard and soft power. Whether it is Netflix or Amazon or, labs or Harvard or whatever, the United States has a combination of both these things. It can have a man sitting, it can have an operator sitting in Nebraska and fire a missile at somebody in Afghanistan. It can even target India if it chooses to do so. But the same United States would not be able to protect Saudi Arabia if the Houthis or whoever decide to use a drone and take out 1/3 of Saudi Arabia's refinery. So that's where we are now. So that will be one major element of the triangle. The second will be China, where again, as I had said earlier, 27, 28, it will become the number one GDP, but not the number one military. And India, even if it doesn't become a $5 trillion economy in this period, would still be at the third ranking as a single state. Meaning that whether it is a Germany or a Japan, demography does not favor them. And it's very unlikely the European Union is going to be able to get its own act together very soon after this hemorrhaging of Brexit. So my own assessment is that the strategic triangle would comprise of these three actors, unless there is some very, as I said, unanticipated black swan in these three countries, which is possible, by the way. The United States is actually looking at the possibility that Donald Trump might encourage his own support base to jettison the Constitution, and he would become Xi Jinping, president for life. This is being discussed on social media in some extreme, parts of the United States fringe elements. So I'm just saying these are low probability, but they would have very high consequences. India, if it makes certain choices that may not be detrimental to national security, we might have an internal security situation, whether it is triggered by Kashmir or it is triggered by some other aspect, which again we might find very difficult to contain. So all the oxygen that India wants, that it could otherwise use for external, shall we say, activities or endeavor, will be consumed internally. China, similarly, as I said, if there is any challenge domestically, there could even be a challenge to Xi Jinping's leadership, which experts have spoken about, saying that after all, China is a ruthless kind of race for, I remember going to China once and having a chat once with some of the academics and whatever. This was a time when there was this very famous incident of a man called Bo Xilai. I don't know if you know this name, but he was seen as an alternate candidate to Xi Jinping. So it was either Bo Xilai or Xi Jinping. And he was supposed to be in the other camp, Jiang Zemin, Shanghai, etc., etc. And there was a murder charge that was put on him about some foreign lady and something, very complicated. So I happened to be in Beijing at that time for some conference. I was talking to some of my academic friends and I said, my God, this is pretty ruthless. It appears as if, because he disappeared, basically, Bo Xilai. So I said, there must have been blood on the floor. Now I know I'm being recorded, so I'm saying this very cautiously, that, this Chinese academic sort of told me, forget about blood on the floor. Chinese history is, you won't find the bodies. Very serious. Chinese leadership is ruthless in terms of who emerges, in terms, it's not the kind of democratic kind of norms that we are used to. So I'm just saying that when we talk about black swan events, there are various, an analyst should be able to think of, even low probability, high consequence kind of exigencies. So the challenge for India, and this is where I'm really going to close, is to say that how do you manage the strategic triangle? Because for India, the challenge is you have to manage the relationship both with China and the United States, knowing fully well that both of them have in the past been relatively insensitive to India's own core interests. The United States, if you look back, our bonhomie is barely 10 years old. It's from Manmohan Singh Bush 2008 onwards. The relationship is improving. It's a good thing. So there is an asymmetry here. There is again a contradiction here, meaning that the people-to-people relationship is very robust. I'm sure many people here have either family or friends who are working in the US or aspiring to go to the US. Middle-class India has got one or two representatives who are in the US. Many of them are US citizens. Now, this is part of globalization. This is like to be accepted. But state to state, we've had a number of issues where we have not seen eye to eye. Whether it is the Mumbai attack and David Headley or, United States, Pakistan, we have to live with these realities. So a lot of people talk about India and the United States as allies, and I keep saying we are getting mixed up. We do not have such a close, we are not allies. We are partners, yes. But I think India and the US are like two porcupines, who are trying to make friends. So you have to move one quill at a time and then see whether or not we can, proceed ahead. But that's the nature of the beast in the 21st century. With China, as I said, we've identified all the areas of discord, suspicion, Pakistan, investment, WMD, etc., etc. But the reality is that these three economies have to engage with each other. The period that we are talking about, maybe both United States and China will be above 20 trillion, maybe. India may be above 5 trillion if all things are equal and we are able to sustain the growth rates that we are talking about. By the way, that growth rate will depend on your generation. Young India, how educated you are, how competent you are, how much you contribute to the GDP, whether you manufacture or you're in the service sector or you're in artificial intelligence or 5G or whatever. We don't know where that's going because we have not invested adequately is what I feel. But even if you are not at the same level, you are still part of the triangle. So the challenge for India is going to be managing these two asymmetrical relationships. One with China, one with the United States, and we have to constantly keep in mind that there have been periods in history when these two countries, United States and China, have had a very close relationship for their own reasons. As I said, the opening was provided by Nixon and Kissinger. In the Cold War, they decided that they would be on the same side. So in geopolitics, there is nothing like, you can predict and say it is cast in stone. We talk about Palmerston, we talk about no permanent friends, no permanent allies, etc. I am saying that even the interests of states might get qualified. So the very idea of permanence now, at one time we used to say that countries only have permanent interests. I am taking the liberty of suggesting to you that even your interests might get modified in how you define your interest and how you prioritize that interest. Today, a good example is that with President Donald Trump sitting in the White House as the US president, he is determining what will be the US national interest. For 20, 30 years, ever since the end of the Cold War, the United States believed the free market. It believed in WTO. It wanted globalization, access. Today, Donald Trump has come and the first thing he did was to say that TPP is cancelled. We are stepping out of it. So the interest has changed. It has changed because of one individual. Whether or not that would be retained by the next person, we don't know. So my point is that we are now in a moment in global history of complexity and flux. It's complex flux, if I could put it that way. There are many kind of, shall we say, patterns that are contradictory. And is this a audience that is familiar with quantum computing? You know what it means, right? So if you know the essentials of quantum computing, I think the challenge for nations, policymakers, and frankly even civil society is to be able to comprehend this contradiction and have the ability, like India will have to engage with China on trade. If India has to reach $5 trillion, it has to have a robust trade not only with the US but also with China. No amount of doubling your trade with Bangladesh and with Kenya is going to help you reach $5 trillion. I mean, they're important countries, but they don't have the scale. And yet, India would have to live with Chennai Connect, Doklam, ensure that there is no more Doklam, deal with the fact that China is going to support Pakistan in relation to terror and Hafiz Saeed and whatever. And in China is not going to enable India's entry into the United Nations Security Council, whatever they may say diplomatically, and yet be able to manage its own relationship both with, as I said, the big players, and accept the reality that in a country like, say, Bangladesh, Chinese submarines are there. China is the largest exporter of military inventory to 3 of India's neighbors. Who are those 3? Pakistan, Bangladesh, and Myanmar. India will have to accept Nepal's connectivity with China. So this is what I mean by the quantum computing part, that you will have to do 0 and 1 concurrently and keep a happy face, when you are dealing with that. So that is the way. But let me stop here because these are issues that we can discuss. I'm sorry I've gone by half an hour too. I plan to finish at 6:30.